Welcome to Pure Signal, where we cut through the noise to bring you what matters in technology. I'm Vincent Yates, the Global Chief Data Scientist and your data guy. I've been the head of data science at Uber, at Microsoft, and at GE, bringing you a data and analytics view to everything we talk about. Joining me is our Global CTO, Jason Goth. He's our systems development and operations expert. Sounds right. Yeah, I like that.
I'll take it.
And Kevin Erickson, our North America CEO and our business strategy expert. Between us, we've built enterprise mission-critical systems that use data and AI for 60 of the Fortune 100s. We're here to filter the most important developments in technology through the lenses of data, operations, and strategy to bring you actionable insights for your organizations. Let's get to it. Today, I want to talk about what do organizations actually believe. I'm not talking about what platitudes are on the wall in the lobby or what platitudes are in the HR handbook or even what's on the website. We are in a very turbulent world right now. The markets are shifting all over the place. This comes off the back of two massive shifts, whether that be COVID or the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And what we're seeing at this point in time, I believe, is what companies actually stand for. Not what they say, but what they actually do. And I just read a fascinating book by Alex Karp. It's called The Technological Republic. And he paints a really fascinating and frankly stark picture of Silicon Valley. It turns out, or he reminded me, I guess, that Silicon Valley actually started off as a almost quasi-government funded agency, which is they were very government aligned. They were very much the defense-driven machine. If you think about sort of the military-industrial complex, that was Silicon Valley. I mean, if you think about Boeing, Lockheed, all of these great companies came out of there. All of the research from ARPA, et cetera, was for there. Stanford, of course. And what's so fascinating is now we fast forward 50, 60 years, 70 years, and what is it today? Quite the opposite. In fact, today, if you look at most Silicon Valley companies, they're actually almost proud of the fact that they're anti-government or not associated with the government in any meaningful way. And I think that sort of is a really fascinating thing to dig into. He actually calls it the elite class, that it's technically brilliant, but philosophically hollow. And that kind of stuck with me. I was like, what is that? Why is that? Why have companies shifted? I mean, we saw a lot of changes through COVID with DE&I stuff. We saw pre that and even post that a little bit with the ESG. And we talked a little bit on the podcast last time that seems to be going out the window as well right now, the ESG stuff. The priorities are shifting once again in organizations. We see boards changing as a result. And so what is it that companies actually care about? And that's where we are in the market, I think. With the tariffs changing, people have to make choices as the world is changing around them. And that ultimately raised sort of a deeper question, a tension in my mind. Another great author, Timothy Keller, in Every Good Endeavor, talked about that there really cannot be an organization that's truly neutral. Even the most agnostic-seeming companies operate on an underlying belief system. And then the question is, well, if they're seemingly neutral, but they must actually have a belief system, what is that belief system? And we'll get to this in a second. I think most companies operate off, this will be great for you, Kevin, Milton Friedman's sort of shareholder primacy idea. But before we get there, I want to talk about this idea just a little bit. The setup was really surprising to me, I guess, when I had never put it together in that way before reading this book. And I was curious, have you guys seen the same? If you think about the companies you've worked for, back to the point where it's a lot of the Fortune 500 companies at this point, have you seen many companies that seem to have a true conviction and belief that they use to rally the organization holistically? Or is it largely whatever we have to do to make profit and hit our quarterly numbers? Thoughts from either of you?
No, I think it's interesting the way that you described the first author and the way they talked about Silicon Valley. I mean, I think you could make that same discussion around Ivy League education right now, or elite education, right? There's some of that similar element of that. You know, I think there is a lot of I'll start with the MBA and move backwards. You know, obviously, I think it's interesting to me the rise of having to teach ethics at MBA programs, at elite MBA programs over the last generation, which seems interesting to me, which then now has been also the rise in the last 2 or 3 years of having to teach happiness at elite MBA schools. I think those are kind of just interesting trends. Like, you have to think about, So the negative impact of shareholder primacy is like, hey, I'm going to be able to do whatever I want, how that plays out. Therefore, you have to teach ethics. But I think that ultimately, to me, it's individual choice. I mean, so again, it's going back to every good endeavor in terms of where is that source of where you're coming from on that. Answering your question, though, specifically around what a company stand for, or just even going back to the specifically, hey, we've worked at all these companies, it's been interesting, being a consultant for, really the majority of my career, having examples of working early in my career at a Dow Chemical in Midland, Michigan, where the company is the fabric of that town and wouldn't exist without that town. So, I mean, there's a whole sense of just community-driven pride for working for that. I had that in my own family. My father worked for a company town, and to where, people are just kind of doing it to drive whatever experience, dollar, whatever it might be. So I think it probably is really different, and I think it's probably really evolved over a number of years. I mean, I think even riffing off the Silicon Valley stereotype of, trying to create, dollars at the pace that you've seen the last 2 generations or last 30 years of like, companies that are $1 billion unicorns off ideas and, linking that to some of the companies that have been around for a long time and, years on years of steady growth to kind of generate that type of market capital. And so I think it goes back to ultimately there is competitive advantage, not surprising, I would say that, around how you approach that. And if you can have companies that are trying to tie to not only their employees and to their customer base, that there's something about that is greater than just simply, we exist to just exist or we exist just to create a profit. I mean, I think that's partly trying to create that value prop around that. How high of importance of that, what should it look like? I think this is where I struggled at times, to be honest. I've debated with some professors around just the importance of some of the stakeholder capitalism. Again, that's kind of also slowly gone out a bit over the last couple of years. But I think I fundamentally challenged just with the construct of that a company would exist and people would value a company more just because of that element, and the stakeholders need to be broader than just simply, we exist to create great products for customers that has a return. That return can go back to our employees. That can go back to our shareholders or investors. But to start bringing in a lot of folks that don't have any real skin in the game and say they deserve a stake of that too is ultimately that doesn't make any sense. I mean, so who's going to win at the end? It's not going to be that group unless it's in a government regulated type environment. And so I think it's actually an interesting question right now to think about why you do exist. And I think sometimes the pure shareholder, that classical, we exist for that. I think that's a little cheese whiz too. I think that's not exactly true. But to say that you exist to create profit, I think absolutely should be true. And whether you're in a for-profit or a non-profit environment, you should try to be efficient to drive economic value for what you do and have that be for the common good.
I know, Jason, you spent some time actually early days working in the defense industry, doing some cool, top secret stuff. Like, what did that feel like then versus now? Could you imagine going back and working for the same kind of company?
Well, I think, a lot of those companies, and I think they're not just defense, but outside of defense, like they kind of rally around kind of a shared mission, right? It is a mission to, protect, the United States. And I think there's other industries where that's true, where they have or industry companies in other industries where they have a mission, a goal, something, we're trying to help people get financing, right, for cars or whatever. I kind of also go on a random walk here. The setup made me think of Bell Labs. There's a great book called The Idea Factory, which is really long and dry, but it was fascinating.
It's a great book. Great setup, Jason.
I loved it.
That author definitely wants to come on our podcast.
Yeah.
Kill me.
That's a book signing. You're the author of the long and dry book.
But it is really fascinating, how much innovation came out of Bell Labs.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
incredible.
Between like 1948 and like 1960 or something, it was like half the Nobel Prizes. Yeah. Something crazy. I mean, everything from transistors, right, to lasers, radar, information theory, right? Claude Shannon, developed information theory while there, right? Which is between that and the transistors is what has driven, computers, right? And Unix, C, right? And the C language out of Bell Labs. And, what I did not know is that the founder in the early 30s, or the first, I guess the first kind of big director that really took them, to prominence, was a man named Mervyn Kelly. And the point of Bell Labs was that they were afraid the government was going to break them up, which they eventually did in the 70s. But this is all the way back in the 30s. They were afraid the government was going to break them up as a monopoly, and which they were. But they said, look, if you will let us do this, we will make so much money. We will carve off a huge section of it, and we will use that for research to develop and the products that we'll develop, which will be for the public good. And also the government can use them with no license. So everything they develop, the government could use for free. And the government could use that then to give value to people. And so, which I thought was really interesting. And, it was a very, very, look at what they developed.
Right.
And I think about now, like things, like Google and Alphabet, following that model where, Google throws off so much cash. They're investing it into, robotics and self-driving cars and AlphaFold and all of these things. And so I do think that there is a model where, like, if you have a goal, a vision, like we want to help do this, right? Whatever that is, and you can make a lot of money, there's an opportunity then to drive a lot of innovation, and that innovation spawns entirely new industries, and I think that rising tide lifts all boats, and I think that's a really good model. Is that what people do? I don't think so. That's not a widely adopted model. It's I think there is a lot of the shareholder primacy. But I do think the companies that actually do well have a real goal and mission. Where I think you see a lot of them get in trouble is when they deviate from that for strictly the basis of shareholder primacy. But I think the other things, like, I think that has to be this is kind of a tautology, but a valuable mission, right? A mission that people will buy into, literally buy the products, invest capital, right, to see its development. Let's take self-driving cars as an example. Like, we think there's a tremendous value to society and as a whole, and that makes it incredibly valuable, and therefore people are willing to invest in it and buy self-driving cars. So that's kind of a closed loop market that really takes off. I don't know if any of that made any sense, but I do think there are a lot of companies where they're just, I'm a holding company, I'm going to buy whatever I can just to maximize profit, and I don't know that those ever drive any real
I want to pick up on this thread.
Long-term value.
This thread,
I don't know.
the thread that you started to lay here, which is kind of my point, I think, which is there was a point in time, post-World War II in particular, was probably the peak of it, when everybody in the country seemed to rally around the idea of making America great, effectively. Not again, but the first time. Yeah. And in whatever was required during the war and post-war to make that a reality was just done. There wasn't a question. That was the mission, and people put more into it. Like Kodak is another example. Like during the war, a huge number of inventions were made, including like bombing systems and targeting systems and photography systems that ultimately drove enormous innovation that they capitalized on later.
The CCD for digital cameras was also a Bell Labs invention, right?
Amazing. Exactly. And so my point was, like, they just said, look, it's not going to be profitable for us, but this is the right thing to do. And I think that in those moments, you truly galvanize people towards that mission, and they deliver better. And what's happened, I think, since then is we have moved to the shareholder primacy world, where effectively, if in fact neutrality is a myth, then what's happened, it's this. It's I think for the last half century, call it, the belief system has quietly been shifting. And the sort of soul or purpose of the modern corporation has been shifted from, make America great, have our people who are here for their entire career, let's reward them and treat them appropriately, to a world where we're just going to maximize shareholder value, whatever that means. And I think that, while Milton Friedman's doctrine, I think, is sound, and you're right, that setup is like, shareholder primacy is a little bit cheese whiz to that degree, but while it's not pinned on the break room walls, it seems to be embedded pretty deeply in how companies operate, how they invest, how they reward. And again, I don't think it's a broken doctrine. I think it's a good doctrine generally. It's obviously created incredible wealth. It's created incredible invention, incredible innovation. The challenge in my mind is that companies end up chasing the wind almost, the moment. Like if it's really popular to do DE&I, then we're going to go do that. If it's popular to do ESG, we're going to do that. If it's not popular, then we're just going to abandon it. Because we don't really care. We just want to maximize it. And we've seen, by the way, consumers demanded it at these moments. If you didn't believe in whatever they believed in, we're going to boycott your brand. We're going to cancel you. So there was real economic consequences, but because they didn't have a belief system, they ended up just wavering and vacillating back and forth. And so that to me was like the first real tension, which is like if you try to offend no one, do you end up standing for nothing? I don't know. So I guess the question to you guys is that belief of neutrality, is that actually a viable long-term strategy? Or is it just a way to goose quarterly numbers?
I would say there's very few things that you can be neutral on. I mean, just going back to the construct of that. So I think that's by the nature of it, you're going to work through that. I think what's interesting now is that just elevation is like what is important, like what is the purpose? It's just because people continue to evolve. One of the drawbacks potentially of really bright people that are a bit bored is that they find things to make causes, and part of that's just the passage of time through youth to different elements is kind of going through that. I think has just been manifested in different things over the years. But, I think a part of it is that because people don't necessarily believe in creation anymore or creating things that have purpose or just even that sake of curiosity. And so, why could that be? Well, even going back a bit of generational elements of coming post-war, World War II, you had the greatest migration in the U.S. of people coming from agricultural outside into more different environments. Like you had huge migration of people that seen anything different. Well, you fast forward now 5 generations later, and you're like, well, what's that next evolutionary step that you're going to go do? What does that look like? And so sometimes I think it's continuing to evolve into that next thing. So, it's not a yearning for the past back, but I do think people are looking for pure purpose and meaning. I don't know if that can come specifically from a company. That may be able to come from a job or what you do or why. That's why I think you think about organizations that have some sort of cultural goodness to what they do is kind of valuable. And I think that companies, Apple, for example, that they have a core for what they're, at least this last 2 generations of what they were building and why. I don't know if people felt the same when they were building certain products or different elements of that. But I think it's interesting for you as a company, how you capture into that. And I think as an employer, whether that be we have a product that makes a difference, or whether it's because I like it to be here because I enjoy working with who I'm working, or I feel like I can develop. I think there's different elements of that, and those are all things to tap into. And I think that we're always playing in the tension of regulation and control, those elements of that too. And so, but I would still submit, and this is partly why I do human capital businesses primarily that are driven by technology, is there is something fun about building something that lasts. We've joked about this before at our common employer. Like, we don't have any employees that work for us that couldn't get a job anywhere else. So it's this idea that we're creating jobs and things like that is kind of foolish. But this idea that we can grow talent, we can create new elements of that, we can have people achieve things they didn't do, all while serving clients. There is nobility in that. Not Bell Labs. We're not creating new inventions per se, though we did birth the book. You guys birthed the book.
And several patents, thank you.
And several patents, yes.
Okay.
And I think that I'm going to still believe that there's value in that. And for me, if I'm biased based on my booth, University of Chicago upbringing, I'm always going to kind of be going back to why I think that you having purpose, but I also don't think purpose is simply about profits. There's other reasons that go into that.
I think maybe a better way to say what I was trying to say earlier was like, I don't know that like purpose, if we want to use the word purpose versus, shareholder primacy, are mutually exclusive, right? I think in a lot of ways, purpose may be an input to the latter. What are the most profitable companies right now? Well, you would say all of Elon's companies, like he has a purpose. SpaceX, I want to make, humanity.
Let's go to Mars.
Multi-planetary. Starlink, I want to connect, people in a multi-planetary way.
I want
to, yeah, I want to, with the cars, we want to get, fossil fuels out of cars. Even Twitter, I wanted to, because he had the belief, or whatever you agree or not, that I want, to be free speech is an absolute, human right. And so he has these beliefs. And, I think what that does is attract people that share those beliefs that will then want to work hard, and that is an input into great financial return, right?
Well, I just think to that point, like what's interesting here is you mentioned Elon's company is going to bring that up in 1 second, but if you look at the shift in Silicon Valley right now, broadly speaking, the best companies are private. And they're private not because they're new, they're private because they're intentionally choosing not to go to public markets.
Stripe.
I mean, Stripe's an example. Palantir is an example. That company's like 20 years old and it was just so old. Andrew, who's building the weapons company, defense company, like these companies that believe in that sort of deeper meaning are also saying to some degree, apparently, that they don't believe the public markets are the right place for them because shareholder primacy will become the demand and they're unwilling to compromise on their core belief. Elon obviously has done it with Tesla, but he also pays the price with Tesla every day. I mean, that stock is so volatile for exactly these reasons. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I revert back a bit before I go back maybe to Tesla. I think even some of those examples of companies, they all made their money someplace else. So it's like, so not to say that
the founders did.
The founders did.
Yeah. And
so that gave them some freedom.
Right.
But I think it's interesting that we start.
So fascinating.
Yeah,
it seems like you have to have that, like if you're forced to subject yourself to the quarterly earnings, you can't do it.
And it's not just, it's quarterly. I think it's interesting around Silicon Valley, around the whole, and you guys know my background, I debated between iBanking and private equity and consulting. And I think one of the things that was not as attractive about some of the financial modeling type pursuits is that, you're essentially the money flow, the return flow is going to financial engineering versus, I think, creativity and building something. So I think it's interesting with Silicon Valley, at least the Silicon Valley from the last 50 years, is that without that early venture capital type environment, really many ways people leaving Bell Labs and other East Coast companies going west, like you wouldn't have created that environment. But one of the old adages in both private equity, obviously, recently with Berkshire and how that their old model, like we buy in people. Well, I think that comes play into that, right? I buy people, I invest in people. Well, if you're investing in someone who wants to build something for a purpose, you may assume private equity or private public financing to be able to work through that. But you're building versus, why do I exist? Well, I exist because I want to get rich fast, or I want to build that. And I think that there is an element of the whole private equity component of that with you. Once you're on a shot clock of sorts to be able to have an outcome, that creates environments that lead to things that make it more difficult for this. Mm-hmm. So whether it be having public, companies that are private, or companies that that they're building for things that are much longer, I think that it's an interesting conundrum a bit because do you have to go build certain things almost in a fast and reckless and a quick way to be able to go do and fund what I really want to do? I mean, we see that all the time in people's lives. I like to think that we could be more nuanced than that. But I do think that living to the tyranny of a private equity expectation or the tyranny of a public earnings call it creates focus, but it creates short-term focus, which can be pretty challenging.
Yeah. So I want to pick up on this too then, which is like we see this sort of pendulum from public markets that are very short-term focused, they're a bit myopic sometimes, to the private equity or private funding in many cases in the private markets we see for these longer growth term companies. Well, here's where it gets interesting in my mind. So despite all of the boardroom polish and comms team finessing to make CEOs sound amazing and perfectly inoffensive, it's not actually the smooth CEOs that are winning the ultimate loyalty. It's frankly the rebels, the iconoclasts, the ones who are picking fights and doing it in a public way and planting flags that are frankly sometimes I think just for the sake of being contrarian. Elon Musk is a great example, of course, back to him, right? He talks about the woke mind virus is civilization's greatest threat. We have Alex Karp, again, the founder of Palantir, who says he builds tech for soldiers, not for shoppers. He's actually quite denigrating to the consumerism that we have in most of Silicon Valley. And then we have Toby, who treats his Shopify. He was famous for saying it's a team, not a family. Remember during COVID, like everybody said, this is our family. And that was across every company and says, you guys are not my family. I'm not going to treat you like a family. Stop pretending you're my family. You're my team. You need to act appropriately. And so what's so fascinating is these aren't just product leaders. They're really belief leaders. They're people who are trying to galvanize and provide a cause that people ultimately follow, I think, in a unique way. Even more recently, kind of fascinatingly in my mind, Zuckerberg, who's actually still a publicly traded company, but he owns these masterful secret shares that only he has, and they count for a huge voting right. So in some sense it's public. On the other hand, he has complete authority to do whatever he wants. He's really, he really embodied that sort of toned down beige, CEO, and went from his hoodies back to the suits in the room. And, he was just very flat across the board. And now he's, an MMA training, Joe Rogan, pot smoking, I don't know. He's going to buy up all of Hawaii. He's turned to the opposite. He's sort of embraced this machismo view. And remarkably...
The pre and post Sandberg era.
That's exactly right. And remarkably, it seems like people are appreciating that. They appreciate the loyalty. I think that there was this moment when consumers, shareholders, employees said, look, it's like the Instagram filters back, in the early 2000s. It's just too fake. They want to see the raw. They want to see the real. They want to see humans with flaws. And so I guess the question is something like, why do people, whether it be employees, consumers, investors, seem to crave that connection, even when it comes down to controversy? Why is it that they show that deeper loyalty to the provocative, the belief-driven leaders in organizations?
But I don't think that's just maybe we're seeing it manifest now in these different examples. I think people are attracted and follow people that are bold. Again, that's a very simplistic statement, but I think you could look at different genres. You can look at different scientific discovery. You can look at obviously military, other elements of that. I think that I think we're all looking for meaning and purpose, and again, people find that in different things. It's if you're going to invest 2/3 of your time or whatever it may be, depending if you're working on a Silicon startup, 2/3 of your waking hours or more or hours just available to you and these things, you're going to want to do it for something that's got some type of purpose, or it's going to be an individual. And I also do think this is, again, probably an overly simplistic statement. Financial freedom allows you to do different things that are definitely more risk-taking. I'm sure there was personas with Musk. Musk is such a fascinating individual just because of how much he's created over his career. But yet, when you sold your first company when you're 23 for a couple $100 million, that gives you some flexibility to continue to grow through that. And I'm not saying that he acted that way, but that was an atypical path. I think even more atypical. Google's,
he went all in several more times over and over. Just kept doubling down.
Yeah.
I'm going to go all in again and again on the brink of bankruptcy several times, right?
Yep.
It's incredible for sure.
And I think there's probably that persona of you're such utter confidence in who you are and what you're going to do, and I think that you get the boldness of that. I think it's just why people evolve on that. It'd be interesting. This is the generation of executives that we're seeing. It'd be if we were to go back a generation,
and Steve Jobs,
you would see that. Ellison, right. They did it in their own ways. Ellison was buying Hawaii before Musk did. In fact, Musk is buying from, right. And then I was Zuckerberg. So I think it's an interesting element of also they're compulsively driven to do things. And sometimes when you've tackled about everything else, what are you going to go tackle next? And I think that some people probably put that into different pursuits. Obviously we're talking about such a small percentage of business executives and leaders in the world that fit this category, but there's many people running many companies and organizations that don't have that skill set or that interest, and so they're doing that for still creating purpose and meaning for what they do.
Yeah, I was going to mention that it's. I think this has always been true. Back, Jobs is an example back, and Bill Gates and.
Well, I think Jobs is another example where he ultimately got fired when they were public because he was such an iconoclast.
Yeah.
Because he was such a provocative person. They're we don't want you. We're going to bring in the Pepsi CMO. He's going to run it. We're going to be super polished. He's a marketer by trade. And what happened? It was a disaster, obviously.
I agree, though. Kevin, there is some, I think fortune favors the bold in that, but I think it's more than that. I think it's that people are authentic, right? That it is easy to get behind someone who is being authentic, and you can trust them. Like you're not talking to a car salesman. You meet these people all the time. They're all smiles, and they're fake, and they tell you what you want to hear, and then you leave and you're like, is that any of that true? I mean, do I need to watch my back? And it's just really hard to put in any extra effort, right? Or to do, go the extra mile when you're just not sure, like, that guy's going to, sell me down the river, the old joke about the car salesman selling their grandmother, and I just think that people want to know if you're authentic. Look, people can disagree with you, then they'll not invest, right? They'll find someone else authentic that they do agree with to invest with. But when it's someone that, like, they don't know if this is really what they believe or not, like, why do I want to invest in that, right? And or that person. And I know we're talking a lot about probably about startups and growth for growth companies, not these kind of long-term established companies, but even the long-term established companies, I think, could refine their purpose, right? I think most of them, had a purpose, whether that be, Ford, right, or AT&T, with the original Bell Labs or Bell telephone, right? And I think, if they refound their purpose around, connecting everyone across the country, and I don't want to say even now, I mean, Verizon has had some, great innovations in the cell phone area. So has AT&T. And so, I think it's not a binary, right, thing. I think there are pockets in companies that do that, but I think that's always been true. And the companies that really have that purpose have always went out and will continue to.
I think that's what's interesting about when you get into the whole, you take it back to the curiosity and like the Bell Labs to Fairchild to Intel, right? There's kind of those different generations of how you go through some of those different story arcs. But like just going back into really stakeholder capitalism, and there's elements of it that I don't like personally. I don't like the public necessarily element that's saying, hey, the public says we have a stake in that. But the idea of a company having a purpose, and some of it's for the owners, some of that's for the employees, some of that's for the customers. That, I mean, to me, that creates purpose and resonance with, people, you have consumers are attracted to brands that have that type of perspective. I think employees want to work for a company that's more than just, making a widget. Unless you might be in a city where, hey, the only thing in that city is something that makes widgets. So therefore, the purpose of that widget making company is actually to help sustain the area that place is at. So it's still a purpose that exists that's outside of just simply to the owners of the business. But I think that's a unique way in a time for companies and for organizations, because in this case, it's not just companies, that you can reconnect to why you exist and understand what you do that. I think our business, there's a lot of reasons why we exist, but I don't think we would say we exist primarily to drive profits back to shareholders. I think it's more around how do we motivate people? How do we serve client needs, and how do we work through that? Yes, we have something we have to return, and those expectations exist, but I don't know as an executive team we sit around saying that's the only reason why we exist. It's more about that. I think other companies I'm not trying to put our company up on some pedestal. Never would do that from this sense, but I do think that there is a lot of companies that are out there trying to way you attract employees and clients and customers based on some of these ideals.
Well, I think there's, the purpose is important, but I think you also have to make a great product, right? Like that somebody wants and that is valuable. And I think you have to return capital to investors. And so it's not like these are either or things. I think there's some amount of, all of these different factors in every company. I think what you're talking about is when they get out of whack, right? When it becomes only, the shareholder. It reminds me of, like, I always have this, what's the book? It's a Nietzsche book. There's a little guy, he's like a giant ear. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the point of that is, like, he's all out of balance, right? Like his ear, he doesn't have, everything else. And so it makes you make bad decisions. Whereas, if you've got all of these things, we do have a good purpose. But we do run a good business, and we do make a good product. We do care about making money. We do pay back our shareholders. We do give great opportunities to employees to go to work on cool things and innovate. And we do contribute back, some of this innovation or, spin off new businesses, and we don't get stale. I think all of those things have to be in the appropriate balance.
That's exactly right. And that's why I think if you're sitting in the C-suite or the boardroom today, there's this natural instinct that we've seen that's been really, I'll tell you, I've done a lot of training over the past even just 5 years when we've gone through all these waves where the instinct and the reflex is, let's just not ruffle feathers. Let's stay out of it. Let's not comment on that. Let's just be quiet. And I think that the problem is silence is actually not neutral, and you can't be neutral. Silence will be interpreted. It does send a signal. And in some cases, I think it erodes trust faster than actually just taking a stand. And that's why, to me, the belief of what you stand for as a company is not a philosophical one where we've mostly spent the beginning of this conversation. We'll pivot to the real. To me, it's really a strategic one. What do you stand for? And I think this is where leadership actually becomes authorship. Getting to define that for your company, you're not just managing risk, you're actually defining the meaning. And that, to me, I think is what differentiates really great companies that we've talked about. The question is, how do you do that in a public market? And I think, to your point, startups have a huge advantage. And again, I don't know that SpaceX is exactly a startup anymore, nor is Palantir. They're huge. They're gigantic companies worth trillions of dollars probably in a public market kind of setting, but they're still private technically. What does that really look like, and how do you do that? And so I guess the question then becomes a bit of like, how do you actually take a stand? How do you decide when it's worth taking a hit on quarterly numbers to stand up for the thing you believe in? We believe our customers are a top priority in delivering great value. So how do we decide, what? We messed this up. It's worth taking a $2 million hit this quarter. Even though we're going to miss our numbers, it's worth doing that to stand for the values that we actually believe in. Versus, well, man, let's just kind of sweep it under the rug and, yeah, that wasn't a great project, but we made it through kind of thing. I think that's the core question. And again, I think it's really important right now. We can get to the real thing if you want. Do you have any comments on that setup part? Or?
No, I was going to say, don't get me started on Sonos. It's like I still can't connect to my Sonos system.
Yeah. So I think this is the reason I think it's so important and so timely. It's not a philosophical debate, it's a strategic one. And it's timely right now because I really do believe we're at this AI maximalist moment where it will become the new corporate doctrine. Yeah, you're surprised I got to AI.
I was about to say, I was wondering how he was going to work in
how
AI.
I get to AI.
And technology and from a philosophical, what's the purpose of a corporation?
It's for AI, obviously. Come on. We knew it was there. The bridge was
like,
just...
We're an hour in and I haven't heard any AI yet.
I buried the lead. Well, I think this is the point. Belief is not enough. I think in the era of Gen AI, there's this enormous force that will radically transform organizations. And I think it's inevitable, and I think it's unavoidable. And it's not really about efficiency. It's about experience. It's about beliefs. Where are you going to remove people from your company so that you let AI do that? That's a core question people don't have to work out. Where are you going to let the AI communicate with your consumers versus a human? That's something you're going to have to work out. I think that these kinds of questions are actually really important, and I don't think there's not an obvious, well-defined answer at this point. And so, from my standpoint, the biggest challenge that every company is going to face is where do you do those things? But then, most importantly, what does it look like? What does that actual interaction look like? How do you have this synthetic personality? How do you define these things in terms of taste and aesthetic? And I think this is what becomes quite fascinating is that aesthetics effectively become the differentiator for companies. How well you integrate the AI to your entire business, from consumer-facing products to process to et cetera. And this is, I think, the challenge is that I'm not sure that many CEOs today have that level of taste, that level of preference, those intuitions to build amazing products, because they haven't been taking a stand for them for a long time. They're happy to make sacrifices on these fronts time and time again for shareholder primacy. Founder-led companies, different story. And this is, I think, what's really interesting. In fact, in technological republics, he calls it plainly. He says, founder-led companies consistently outperform. Why? Because taste can't be outsourced to a committee. Because someone has to say, that's it. That feels right, and overrule the rest of the room. I think that's really profound to me. And I think this is exactly why you see people.
That's in the book.
That's in the book, Technological Republic. Yeah, really good. And that's why you see Sergey Brin coming back to Google, I think. You see him spending hours and hours. He's a full-time job again. He's in there working on the Gemini stuff every day. He's working on the Astro stuff every day. It's why I think that companies like Meta have a really good shot of doing something differentiated. I think it's why Howard Schultz returned ultimately to Starbucks. And you had
3 times.
3 times now, exactly. You had Bob Iger return to Disney. Why? Because they couldn't find professional CEOs that had that flavor, that sense of taste. And my point here is that Gen AI is going to force companies to impose their taste on consumers in a way that will work or won't work, and it's going to be really hard to test.
How do you, I don't necessarily challenge. I'm not challenging the assumption. I guess I will challenge is how is AI, which will change how companies work and interact with their customers and their employees, different than International Harvester with the first reaping machine, Ford with the first automation machine. I mean, there's always been changes that have come in that have changed the way that an employer and an employee interact. How do you think this is different, or?
I think it's exactly the same, but also radically different, because I think the context is different. And the whole setup is, I think, from my standpoint, what makes it different, which is, I think if you go back a generation or two, when you had the same kinds of massive disruptions, technological or otherwise, you had founders or leaders of companies that believed in a purpose for their company. They seem to all have, you even brought up Ford earlier, they have this sense of desire to create something that was well beyond just my quarterly numbers. And I think what's missing is that most CEOs, professional CEOs today, are really great at the financial engineering. That's probably why they got that job from the board. They're great at showing up. I mean, I saw the most amazing thing in GE. When we finally brought somebody else in, the last CEO, he was amazing at tearing that company apart and breaking off the assets and maximizing shareholder value. He did an amazing job. There's no doubt about that. Did that create anything, though? I mean, it created money.
I just want to make sure I understand the point, because I think I agree, but I may disagree about one small part. But, like the other examples, International Harvester, so it changes, the farming business. But a founder-like company, that person has a passion for the actual product and all of those things we talked about, not just the financial engineering. So it's well, how do we use these things to advance those other goals?
That's right. I mean, I think that the core of it is that if you believe AI is a thing, like the Shopify, the Fiverr CEOs, they're being very bold in saying you will use AI or you will not have a job, not at my company, you won't have one here either, but across your entire profession. You're done. They're taking really aggressive, very opinionated stances because they can. And that level of intuition, that sense of taste almost, I think is unique to founder-led companies by and large. And it's survivorship bias. There's no doubt about that. I mean, lots of people try and start companies. Most fail. The 166 that succeed had better intuition. Are they all Elon Musk? They can do it time and time again? Probably not. But I think that there has to be somebody in the room who says, thou shalt do this thing in this way, even though it doesn't make sense, because I see something different. And people have to be catalyzed to move towards that vision they can't see themselves in a way that few organizations can do that, I think.
Yeah, where I'm going at though is I think about there's many things, I use the example of you got to have a great product and you have to run the business well and you have to think about shareholder primacy or about delivering value to shareholders, and you have to think about making great opportunities for your employees, all those things. Mm-hmm. I don't think it is, and maybe you're not, maybe this is what you're saying and I'm misunderstanding. I don't think it is just the product one though, where you have to, it's AI is just a tool and you've got to figure out how to do all of those things better with AI at that same ratio. Right. You can't then let AI get one of those things out of whack, either.
That's correct. Yeah, exactly right. And I think this is the challenge is I think CEOs are going to have a very strong opinion that may not be popular. They're going to have to make big bets that they probably can't know if they're going to work out because, again, these problems have not been solved at scale yet, by and large. And I think that's what will differentiate the winners and losers in this next revolution. The companies that have that opportunity, that have that boldness, that have leaders that have that aesthetic taste are the ones who will win. What do you think, Kevin?
So yeah, I don't disagree. I mean, I think it goes back to this premise. We buy the leaders, we back the leaders. There's lots of different factors that go into that. I mean, again, the financial outputs, the returns, how expected that. I think when good companies are well run, lots of things go into that. But I think when you have the freedom because you have a right spot, right time, good leadership, whatever else, like then you don't have to worry about some of the realities of those quarterly and things, having to do the financial engineering, having to work that way to be able to do that. So I think there's probably, there's obviously some of that just is the nature of what you do. But I'm captivated a bit by, again, what's the purpose of an organization? The Soul of the Machine is a book I read back in grad school, and it's like that whole construct of like, why do we do what we do? And even going back to where we started a bit with some of the stuff back to Friedman, like again, that was a capitalism in we're in a somewhat of a post-capitalist perspective, one that's really tainted through a lot of different elements. If you go back to 20, 40 years ago, we were looking at different economic systems that create value. AI may allow inefficiencies to allow things to be able to persist, but I think part of the reason why you've seen an attack on some of these systems is simply because when they're, this is going to sound cheesy, but when they're done right, you can't beat that. If your purpose is to reallocate money or wealth, or if your purpose is to advocate a certain cause, if your purpose isn't something that has an output that isn't simply around return, I think the return to the shareholder, the return to that ultimately is the most proven way to generate wealth. Sometimes that's used for good things. Sometimes that's used for bad things. Sometimes it's done at exploitation. Some of the times it's done not in that way. But I think ultimately any other political or economic system essentially saying, I pick and choose your winners, which in some ways the founder is saying that too.
That's right.
So why does it work in one setting and why does it work in another? And I think it's ultimately what's the risk of what failure happens.
I think it's the same in both. I think the difference is like entire nations that fail in the former, and it's just a company that fails in the latter.
Yeah.
And I think there's survivorship bias. I think that lots of founders have very opinionated views of what their product or offering or the way they do their work should be. And only some win.
Yeah. Well, and I also sometimes you see it'd be actually a really interesting, I haven't thought about it, it'd be interesting to see the curve, the arc of either an age, right? I think a lot of the tech entrepreneurs, they start very young. And so there's a gift of youth in terms of what you think you can accomplish. And then as you mature into your 30s and 40s, how does that evolve? There's also the gift of freedom, right? I mean, you've kind of made sure that you and your generations of families are secure. That allows you to change your focus on what you're doing, allows you to go back and be aware. That's why I think legacy becomes more important, and different people have different definitions of legacy for them. What does that look like? Some of that's all about that company surviving. Sometimes it's using and going and saving whatever you want to go save. Some of it is more hedonistic, but I think it's just an interesting element of what motivates individuals. And I think for many of us, we're not going to find ourselves probably in that scenario, at least at the examples that we're using today. But then how does that tie back to what we do on a day-to-day basis in terms of how do you motivate your team? How do you create purpose to what you do? How do you work through that? How do people have transparency? I think one of the things that I hope that comes out of this, and I don't know how much AI will influence it, but I think it will in some ways, because it's going to be so much easier to kind of sort through the BS, so to speak, is that if you're honest, if you are transparent, if you treat people with respect, I think ultimately those things are going to lead to better outcomes. Is it a guarantee that you're going to have that? Absolutely not. But I think over time, you'll prove that those are better bets. And I think that's a good thing. And if AI helps you do that, or gives you different ways to do it, or different ways of analysis, and I mean, that would be kind of interesting. But I think everything, you're always going to have to adapt and evolve. And I think AI is just going to force you to do it sooner.
Yeah.
Quicker.
Yeah, I mean, you're focused on the product and taste and aesthetic, and which I agree with, but I just think it is more across the board than that. Like, yes, you can use AI and you can make better products, and you're talking about like, well, the people that the companies that survive have that, it's a survivorship bias. Like, well, yeah, but they didn't have the other things, right? They didn't run an efficient business that made a profit. They didn't treat their employees well, right? There was some reason, like there was a reason they failed. And so I look at more as AI, more like, well, yes, it can help us design and build better products. Now, do you need someone that can really direct that? Yes. But you can also make it a better employee experience. Like, I hate doing my expenses. Like, can that be automated with, and with an AI, you can get rid of some of the mundane stuff that no one likes doing. Can we make it more profitable? Yeah, we can automate and squeeze some tasks out that are, as Dennis would say, accretive to the bottom line. So, and then from an, innovation, disrupt yourself, that gives you some abilities and financial resources and to go do those things. And so it's all of those things. And I think AI drives all of those things. I agree with you on the CEO part, the thing I was going to disagree about, but it also has to be the leaders in charge of all of those other areas too. Okay. That sees how that you can use it in AI to do those areas, right? Because otherwise you get out of whack again.
No, I totally
become
agree.
the giant ear.
And just to clarify, I don't mean aesthetic and opinion just in the sense of like what your consumers see. I mean it holistically.
Yeah.
There needs to be a design choice in what does your organization look like. I think organizations need to be redesigned. I'm not sure IT should sit in the middle anymore. Maybe if businesses can rebuild from the bottom up using generative AI, they should be distributed within. I'm not sure marketing needs to exist as a discipline anymore. I don't know, but I think that this kind of true re-architecting of the entire company, every process, every group, every org chart, requires a sense of taste that I suspect can only be done by the bold, because these things are radical. These things are not proven. We don't have decades of experience and other case studies from B school that we can point to show this is the right way to org. This is the right way to build your organization or your design or your people or your responsibility or even the titles. And that's what I mean by that. I mean it holistically. So I think to that point, we're seeing the first wave of this, I think by and large, with AI. I think the new corporate mandate is AI or die. And I don't mean that in a hyperbolic sense. It's almost verbatim of what CEOs are saying right now from Fiverr, Shopify, IBM, Box. These leaders aren't suggesting that employees learn about AI. They're demanding fluency or they won't have a job anymore. And it's really the second time we've seen language that's that extreme in the recent past, only the second that I can find. The last one was RTO, Return to Office. And Jamie Dimon being like, I don't care how many people sign an effing petition, this is what we're doing. That's what I mean by that aesthetic choice, that taste, that he says, look, that is not the company I'm trying to build. It might work for others. It's not going to work here. I'm not going to allow it. And there's real cost to doing that, I think. If you're not a visionary leader, if you aren't the type that people rally around and just go blindly and say, hey, I like working from home. It's easier for me. It's better for me. Doesn't matter. The leader says we have to go this way, so we're going to go this way. And so I think that's the big thing to me is I think the tone is clear. I think the stakes are high. And I think there is this moment when CEOs are going to have to be bold. And that moment is starting right now. So the penultimate question for you guys is, do you think that these professional non-founder CEOs can learn these skills? Or do you think it'll require an entire shift at the top to leaders who are these iconoclasts, these bold people?
Struggling with the premise of the question because it's again either or. I think that we see the examples of the founders. I think that there's a percentage of known founders of large organizations, some of the ones we're talking about today, compared to the average executive of just a no-name company or whatever. I mean, it's orders of magnitude greater. So I don't know if you have to completely reinvent yourself, but I think that it gives a cautionary tale to what you can do and what you think you can do and how you lead. Being, one of the things that's kind of as we're moving off of some of the things over the last 5-6 years in terms of kind of really social policy that's driving corporate policy is the freedom to be more unique. I mean, I don't think anyone, you weren't going to DEI yourself to profitability. Like that was never going to drive that to, Blackheart tried, right? So it's like, and they backed away from it. So I mean, I think that, So I think it's going to be, I would just say it's more around as leaders, as executive teams, understand what you're doing, be purposeful to do it, be bold, take risk. I think that over the long run, that's going to have a higher probability outcome for you. The more you play it safe, the more you play to what you think it's going to be. It's just ultimately, it's just not all that satisfying. And I think that it goes back, even back to your second book, Every Good Endeavor. Why do we do what we do? What's the purpose of that? And I think there is dignity in just work and creation and curiosity. And the more you bring that in, I think you're going to attract both the employees and the customers that are attracted to that. And I think if nothing else, I think you're going to enjoy the journey more than you would. So.
Love it. Any final takes from you, Jason?
Again, it's not either or. I think, I think of everything like on a bell curve. I mean, some will learn and some will do a really good job in learning and transform. And most will do an average job and some will do a poor job.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think that there's this sort of core question of, should CEOs be the moral leaders of the company? Do they need to be provocative, these iconoclasts? Can organizations actually scale taste, or is it always in the hands of one or two of the founders or sort of those key leaders? And I guess the other part is how do organizations protect themselves from their values drifting? Because I think the most successful companies started with some value-based system and beliefs, and it just drifts over time. I think this is the moment when CEOs are going to have to be bold. They're going to have something to lean back on to actually make these really difficult decisions. What is that litmus test? How do we decide A or B? They both seem promising and terrifying. How do I decide? And I think that's where we are at this point, broadly speaking. Well, thank you guys for joining me on this somewhat philosophical bridge to AI. Ultimately, no technology for you. Sorry, Jason.
But there was tangents.
There were plenty of tangents to be had. So, you're welcome.
All right, we're pure signal now. We don't go on tangents.
We purely signal.
Pure signal.
Pure signal.
Yeah, we purely avoided technology for the last.
Well, I didn't know it's the philosophical pod, but I did bring up Nietzsche. So there you go.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, listeners, for joining us today on Pure Signal. I hope this was informative, helpful. If you have more questions or you're wrestling with some of these questions yourself, feel free to reach out to us at credera.com.